This is my friend Filipa Leonard. Briefly, Filipa is Australian, and Filipa was trained and practiced as an MD, but left her practice so that she could study Indigenous medicine with the Aboriginal tradition in Australia.
Oh,
and she has done that for years and
Fascinating.
is now considered a senior healer within that tradition.
How did you meet?
And she's in New York because she's about to receive her Doctor of Theology degree and become Reverend Dr. Filipa. And she is finishing a course at which institute?
One Spirit.
At One Spirit in trans-traditional
Interfaith ministry.
Interfaith ministry.
Sadly, hello everyone. So
Hello.
pleased to be here. And Berta, I'm so happy to meet you. I've heard so much about you. Now I see how wonderful you are in person.
Well, but it's very nice to meet you, and what an interesting background.
I must say one disclaimer, sadly, it is not a Doctor of Divinity that I'm receiving.
Oh.
It's some kind of One Spirit ordination certificate. It's really not very, it's less academic than I realized, but you know.
This will make you the Reverend Filipa,
but
because you're
make
already the Doctor.
I'm already the doctor. I don't need another doctor, so it makes me the Reverend Doctor, yes.
You have credentials, let's not quibble over them.
May I ask what got you interested in the Aboriginal medicine?
I have a very, very dear friend who's a senior elder, and it's probably not accurate to say I'm one of the senior ones. We're just all in it together, but she's teaching us Indigenous medicine. So there's a small group she's teaching, and I'm privileged to be one of them. So she's a very close friend.
This is interesting to me because just today I was pondering on a dream I had of my father after he had passed. And you describing this brings back this sense that rather than, I'm having trouble putting into words what I'm trying to say, but I've so had this sense with the political and sociological difficulties that America, for example, and the world, of course, in general, is dealing with. There's this sense of predestination, that there's this battle that we already see how it's going. But with what you've said about how they want the learning to be, the knowledge to be passed on, it's as if that there are the other beings, the non-material beings that still have the ability to interact with those who are receptive in the physical world, that they really are working to make a difference in this battle that is so clearly ongoing, and a difficult battle, a serious battle. And that there are still ways that it can be helped, and I suppose on the other hand ways that, you know, the more negative forces can gain power too. And I get a little overwhelmed just, you know, thinking about.
I think there's still a lot of information coming in from other sources, other beings, other
Oh, I sure hope so. I mean, I want that.
We could use it.
Yes. I mean, we're in desperate straits, I feel.
We have to learn to listen more, don't we?
Yes. Yes, very much so.
So I was going to ask Sheikh Al-Bashir, is she familiar with our Muslim names that we normally use in these discussions?
No, she isn't.
Uh-huh.
But she'll have to use the names that are on the screen rather than learning two names from people she doesn't know right away.
So we should forego those?
Keep it simple.
Except in the case of Seda Badriya, who doesn't like to use her given name, as I recall, right?
My given name is the Dark God of Eros.
Okay, the dark god instead of whatever.
Serious? Really? I mean, the Dark God of Eros?
Sure.
Well,
No,
she'll explain what it means if you ask her.
Who's the Dark God of Eros?
Dark god of Eros, Christ of the buried brood, stone-channeled beast of ecstasy and fire, the angelic wisdom in the serpentine desire, fang hidden in the
I
flesh's
think he
velvet
doesn't want to
hood,
be heard.
riddling with desight its visionary good. Anyway,
Was
it's,
that a poem?
yes,
Uh-huh.
Written by,
Brother Antoninus,
Oh,
he
interesting.
has another name, right?
William Everson.
William Everson. All right, that was
Mhm.
going to be my guess. That's your poet of the week or the month.
Yeah, after he left the monastery, after being a monk for 20 years, he lived a solitary life in the redwoods of California alone, and he had these dream visions where he was visited by Native American medicine men, and they initiated him into another path, and so he was something of a Christian shaman.
Well, that is interesting for sure.
Well, should we get on to some questions?
I'm just fascinated with everything we've already introduced.
Since I brought the Reverend Dr. Filipa here, you're welcome to ask her questions.
Well, what is the state of the indigenous traditions in Australia?
Well, I would say they're alive and well. It's the oldest living culture on Earth.
Yeah.
They've been there for 60,000 years plus, and their traditions and teachings are still present, and really they're much more honored and they're used often in public. We always have welcome to country, acknowledgement of country, and within their own culture, certainly the languages are being revived. It's really very positive. Of course, they have been through horrific times and a lot of the teachings were destroyed, but there's great honor for them and resurgence, really.
They're being treated much better now than they were like 50 years ago or so.
Yeah,
sure.
we're so far behind, and the health is still appalling, and education is still way behind the non-Indigenous populations. Incarceration is extraordinarily high amongst the Indigenous population. There's still so far to go.
Right. Yeah, it's still basically holdovers. Well, let's call it structural racism, which people don't like to talk about here so much, but it's there nonetheless. But it's encouraging to hear. I mean, they're still heavily discriminated against, and they, in all kinds of ways, and their life is hard. But it sounds like they are becoming part of the culture in general, to some extent, rather than just completely ostracized and ignored.
There's much more honoring than there was, and much more acknowledgement than there was.
That's a big improvement.
But we have so far to go, and it's interesting because there's a political movement on in Australia now to make an Indigenous voice to Parliament, and some of the Indigenous people are for it and some are not. So it's such a complex situation.
Right, I can see.
But I'm very, very blessed to be so close to so many within the Indigenous community. It's my great joy and privilege.
Right.
I'm very grateful.
It's a privilege to have a foot in each culture. I mean, that is an incredible enrichment to your life, and it sounds like it's going to be beneficial for all. Well,
when I met Min Maya, I was extremely ill, and so ill she actually thought I was going to die, and and she really has, through my time with her, I've learned a way of engaging in life that's very, very rich. I feel like she saved my life in many ways.
And what's her name again?
Her name's Min Maya. You can look her up, Minmia. She has a book called Under the Quandong Tree.
And did you say earlier that there's a proposal to elect members of the Aboriginals, you could call them, to Parliament, or to have their own separate
There's a proposal to have a voice to Parliament, which is a separate body, but it's a vexed question and probably not one for this kind of forum.
Help or advice or about the climate crisis that can be used?
Well, I think, yes, if we'd listen, there's certain things like burning practices that they've had for generations. They do what's called cool burning. And so they burn at a rate that's slow enough for the animals to be able to remove themselves from the site, and it burns out the undergrowth. And they have systems whereby they do the burning regularly, and that means you don't get this build-up of the fuel.
Right.
You don't have these huge wildfires. But we're starting to bring those in, but it's so delayed. It's a moot question as to whether really there's time to make a big difference, but there's always time to do something.
Right. You can do something good, even you don't have to be that concerned with its ultimate results if it's good.
And the other thing, that there's so many things we can learn from them, but one of the main things me and Maya teaches is to take what you need, not what you greed. So there's very much a culture of you only take that which you need. You don't, like, we only need a couple of pairs of shoes. We don't need 50 or 20 or whatever, so it's always, what are we taking from our environment, from each other, from the land? So that's a very strong message.
That's what allowed their civilization to survive for 60,000 years.
And the other thing they did brilliantly was the acknowledgement and the recognition and the honoring of the oneness of creation. And in the oneness of creation, everything has as much value as everything else. So the ant and the fish, it all has as much right to life as we do. So there's the tremendous honoring of all systems of life and learning from them. That's it. So that's a very big shift.
Yes, we could do with a lot more of that.
Yeah. And sharing equity, they had within their culture a very strong system of equity, so that what was mine is yours. So you share it. Interestingly, within all the tribes in Australia, there was no word traditionally for thank you, because it was what was given with honor and gratitude, but what's mine was yours. So it was a very different sense of ownership than that which we have.
Right. The Native Americans had no sense of property ownership either. I mean, the ownership of the land, they had their territories that they used, but the idea that the white man came with, that you could actually own land, was just completely foreign to them.
Well, and individual ownership. I mean, as you say, they view lands as their land, but not as individual plots and so.
Right. It's sort of like in Genesis, where God gives man dominion over the earth. That doesn't mean tyranny. It means that you take care of it.
Exactly. We're caretakers.
Right.
Yeah. And that we should be responsible for looking after the land and singing up the land and doing ceremony and caring for it.
We should have some gratitude for it.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it is us. It's our land is us.
Right. Right.
There's such a different, deep connection to the land. Very beautiful.
Yes, indeed. Yes, I know. My heart was broken when I heard on the news that some mining company had blown up a sacred place.
Oh,
that was just so painful to hear.
Yes, it was so painful.
What little I know about the Aboriginal civilization is that they have so many sacred places, and they're so important to them. I mean, and they're still alive. They're not just pieces of history.
That's so right. Exactly. It was complete lunacy. It was so despairingly sad. It was horrific when that happened.
Yes. Well,
when did this happen?
It was despicable and devious.
I would say that particular one, maybe 5 years ago.
Yes, about that, I think.
And are those miners still allowed to be mining where they
are. They pay what really is a nominal fine, and they apologize.
Yeah, big deal.
It's terrible. Tragic.
It was hardly a slap on the wrist. I mean, it was just, it's like sort of like the inevitability of the act. Once they've destroyed the place, well, let's move on. Never mind all the tears in the Aborigine people.
And I don't know whether how the Aborigines are divided into different groups that have different things that they follow or do. But there was one group that was saying that every member of the group was assigned a certain area. That's interesting.
We can learn a lot from them.
I was going to suggest we should let Filipa hear us discuss some of our brilliant conversations about these questions that the Dark God is
Would
prepared.
the God of Dark Eras like to read question number 1?
Certainly. If an angel came to you and told you that God told him to tell you that you must give up either doctrine or practice, how would you respond, and which would you give up?
I would want to know which doctrine to give up in favor of which practice, and vice versa.
This wouldn't be a problem for me. I would just say, I don't like that God. I'm switching to another God.
All right.
Well, yes, because it's an impossible choice, because
Exactly.
it leaves you if you choose practice, there's no reason for it. And if you choose doctrine, there's nothing to do.
Excellent.
I know, it's doctrine that you don't practice.
Well, I thought my thought
like
was the whole notion of giving up doctrine didn't make any sense to me. Doctrine is just what you've been taught that you believe is true. And if someone came to you and said, you have to give up what you believe is true, it's just utter nonsense. It's just not.
Although there were times in my life, I was a very, very devout Christian early in my life, and there's certainly some doctrine that I believed was absolutely right then, that I didn't have an actual angel appear to me, perhaps in spiritual form, but maybe in human form. And over the years, God's called me to give it up.
Well, do you really ever give it up, or you just refocus?
Refocus. Well, I've certainly changed what there was a time when the doctrine of only Christians were being saved was very strong within my practice. And thankfully, I've let that one go.
That is a good doctrine to give up.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, you learn all of life is a process of learning, and you enhance what your understanding, and you look back and say, well, I was really mistaken about that. But
yes.
Right. And unlearning.
Well, you could call that unlearning, I guess.
Yes, exactly. I mean, that's important.
Exactly.
You can unlearn habits, I guess.
You can unlearn all kinds of things once they no longer are of use.
Yes, and if you see it that way, all life is an opportunity rather than a challenge. It's not a set of conditions you can succeed or fail at, but only things that change and that you incorporate.
Basically, doctrine tends to be Apollonian and practice tends to be Dionysian. And if you look at Apollonian poetry, it might be interesting. A lot of technique is used, but there's no feeling behind it. Whereas the Dionysian poetry, even if it's flawed in terms of technique, it can sometimes spur one on to an experience in oneself. And also, the fact is, most of the people I know with PhDs are dreadfully depressed and unhappy people. And most of the people I know with Down syndrome who don't even know the barest thing about doctrine, I feel like they're happy and directly in contact with God. So the correct answer is practice is more important than doctrine.
Not only that, if you have good doctrine, you will practice it.
We sometimes call that the school solution, to use a military term. That's the official answer that the questioner has. But it sounds fine.
We're also assuming that the angel came from God.
Well, that's true. That's true. My first response to this was say, get thee behind me, Satan.
That's what I thought. That was mine too. I thought, wait a minute, are you an angel from God or somewhere else?
Exactly.
Well, I thought doctrine was, you might say, the steps towards knowledge, and practice was the means of instilling that impetus or forming yourself in accordance with it. But at any rate,
I think that's the doctrine.
So I think, I think you may be able to give some doctrines a pejorative expression, but that's because they're really not true doctrines.
Yes.
there must something made up.
Well, most of what's called doctrine is provisional at best, because you have to discover the truth for yourself no matter what.
Well, all doctrine by definition is false, but
Yeah.
all experience by definition, even if it's experience occasioned by a psychotic break, is by definition true, even if it's only true subjectively.
Yes, that's right.
Well, I would say, for instance, what the statement that you make to become a Muslim, there is no God if it be not the God, and Muhammad is the messenger of God. That's the doctrine of Islam.
That's a fundamental. Yeah, but it doesn't exclude anything.
Well, it excludes. It excludes things that would be a contradiction to that.
Well, I mean, it's certainly not atheistic, but the point is
Right.
that's simple enough. It shouldn't cause problems.
Well, as I say, though, every tradition has its statements of doctrine, which may not correspond to the statement of doctrine in another tradition.
Of course, but who cares?
They lead to the knowledge that would make both understandable.
Yeah, they open the possibility to that, and then if you start practicing it, you may find out, what's useful and what's not.
Well, there's a bunch of ways of reading the Shahada. You can read it in a very dualistic way, like the vast majority of Muslims do, or you can read it as I do, in a pantheistic way. If there's no God but God, and God encompasses all, then the birds and the fish and the insects, they're all God, and we have to bow down before them.
How could they not be?
But, I would say that those levels of understanding of a doctrine are the levels along which one goes to knowledge. Now then, it is true that the level that someone practices or someone believes in the doctrine of a tradition may be limited to a certain level of understanding. That isn't to say that that doctrine doesn't open up the higher levels of understanding.
You can say the same for practice.
Yes, exactly. I mean, it's all a finger pointing to the moon, and beholding the moon is experiential.
Yeah, I remember.
It doesn't require a description. It doesn't,
I remember when I became a Muslim by giving expression in Arabic to the doctrine that George just put in English. I remember thinking, there is no God but God, and Muhammad is one of his messengers.
Yeah, it doesn't say his
So I
only
gave my
messenger.
little perennialist spin to it, but I don't think it's necessarily a false understanding of that.
No, it doesn't say Muhammad is his only prophet. And in fact,
Yeah.
the Quran makes it clear that
But there
he
were many
isn't.
more before him.
Yeah,
Well,
some of which I have told you about and some of which I have not, it says. So, you have to keep it all open.
That's rather beautiful.
I talked to a priest once who was saying about Christ being a fisher of men, and that he was like that himself, that he stood in the bow of his boat and he beckoned people to come and climb aboard. But he said to me, he could only validate in his self that his boat was a place that they would be saved. He couldn't be pointing them to boats that he doesn't understand it to be so.
Right.
And so
And they might be safe there too.
Well, he's not saying that you wouldn't be. He's just saying that he
doesn't
has
know.
to guide someone to what he knows
Exactly.
is saving.
Sure.
I mean,
I might add here, I have a non-dual interpretation of the Shahada. I think I gave him a Dhakra on this once, because the statement is, I testify that there is no God but God. Finally, that means there is no anything but God.
Right.
So who is this who's testifying?
Good question.
This just reminds me of a treasured memory I have before I was initiated, because I got the opportunity to speak with Sheikh Isa, and I said to him, I had this My only hesitation was that I had this fear that I was somehow betraying Christ. And he said to me, Christ will not rebuke you when he sees you in paradise for entering Islam, because in Islam, you go directly to God. You do not go through an intermediary. You do not go through the prophet. You just go directly to God. And he said, Christ wants nothing more from you than that.
Exactly. And if he weren't pleased by it, what kind of what kind of person would he be?
But it is true that, say, even in Islam, that in Islam you go to God through God. Sure, that's an understanding that the wise have. It's not necessarily an understanding that one has who is immersed in the world. So they come to their understanding through the prophet.
The closest I can come to a shahada, a sort of short statement of faith, was written by Ezra Pound in his cantos. He writes, "The gods have not returned. They have never left us.
Yes.
They have not returned. Clouds processional, and the air moves with their living."
Oh, that's beautiful.
Yes.
Can we have that in the chat, please?
Sure.
That's so beautiful. Thank you.
Yeah, all of this talk about, the struggle to get to God, or the long path to God, and all of that is not without meaning. But let's face it, if God is what people say he is, then he is never not there. And what's the thing in Islam? God is closer to you than your jugular vein.
Yes.
And in
Yes.
Christianity, God is closer to you than your very breath.
Excellent.
I love that.
It's right on. It's spot on.
Even if you do not see God, nevertheless, he sees you.
Yes.
Or she
Nevertheless,
sees you.
yes. There's
Or
the
she
chat.
sees you, yes.
So
All right. Are we ready for question 2?
I was reading it. We've already started discussing it to some extent.
Dark
Let's have
God
the,
of Arabs.
let's
How'd
have
that
the
happen?
official reading of it anyway.
Oh,
Okay. There are tales told of mystics eating the scabs of pox victims, of drinking the water used to wash lepers, etc. Many of these stories are well documented and corroborated by trustworthy eyewitnesses who tell of these mystics, claiming that these vile materials of putrefaction are sweet like honey. Is this a form of medieval mental illness that they could not understand? Or do we, so far removed from these holy people, lack the understanding to comprehend the ecstasies that even base matter could drive the saints towards? For if all is God, are not lice, scabs, and leper water also God?
they are, but it doesn't have to mean anything to me in particular. And I don't know about these saints. If they presumably did it because it made sense at the time, and perhaps it can, conveyed a meaning, but it doesn't sound like a general method. I mean, I don't have to have an opinion on that, I guess, is what I'm saying. Is I know people have done things, and they've done things under the best intentions and perhaps under great inspiration, and I can't judge that, and I don't need to.
I mean, none of the churches or monasteries or convents ever advocated for these things, but
No, of course not.
I think today something analogous would actually be people going under the bridges and tending the homeless. It's something that's necessary, but it's not something that people want to do. They want to donate $1 of their expensive coffee to help the homeless, but they don't want to go out there and physically touch these people and help them through the power of human contact.
Right, and I think these stories illustrate that it's just like the stories in the Bible of Christ healing people, and saints. Was it Damien the leper, and people like that, making the point that regardless of whether you find these people attractive or repulsive, they are still, they have the full value of being people and human beings in the image of God.
Right, and
the
there's
details don't matter too much.
But there is the idea behind it. Like there's that famous story of Saint Francis, where of course Saint Francis grew up a wealthy, sheltered boy, and he was, even after becoming a monk, he was deathly afraid of the lepers, until one day he realized that, you know, one of these lepers could be Christ in disguise. So he started, he ran towards the lepers and hugged one of them, and it turned into Christ.
Yeah, good.
There's a wonderful Indigenous story where Bayami is the Wiradjuri word for God. Bayami looked down upon the earth and saw that he couldn't find compassion anywhere. So he came down to earth, actually disguised as a wombat.
Oh.
Old, scabby, blind wombat. Asking for help, and a whole long parade of animals came along, denying helping this very old wombat because they were way too busy. And finally the kangaroo came along, and in the dreamtime the kangaroo did not have a pouch. She had the baby in her hands, and so she said to the wombat that you're going to have to hang on to my tail, but I'll take you to safety. And so the kangaroo led the old wombat to safety and had him hide in the grass. And he saw the hunters, and she took off to distract the hunters from the wombat so the wombat would be safe. And in that time, she came back after the hunters had gone, and it was dark, and she was crying. And Bayami said to her, "So what happened? What happened?" And she said, "I've lost my baby. I dropped him as I was taking the hunters away from you."
Oh.
And it turns out, so then compassion arose in Bayami's heart. Bayami thought, in the morning we'll deal with it, but said nothing to the kangaroo. And then when morning came, Bayami went out across the land and found the baby, brought the baby back to the mother kangaroo, and placed the joey into the mother's hand. And as the kangaroo looked up, Bayami turned into his own self, and she said, "Bayami, it's you." And he said, "Yes, it's me. And because you had compassion, I'm going to reward you." And he tore off a sheet of paper bark from a tree, and he placed it over her belly. And he said, "I'm going to give you a pouch so that from now on, the joey can be in the pouch, so your hands will always be free to help another." And Bayami said, "So remember that I'm always here, I always see you, and I'll be testing you." So that's the story of how the kangaroo got her pouch.
Like the Aboriginal Good Samaritan, except that it's
Yes.
a divine Good Samaritan.
That's exactly right, except it was a kangaroo was the Good Samaritan. That's and any one person on the street might be Bayami, might be Christ. That's absolutely right.
Exactly. Even if, as you have done this to the least of them, you have done them for me or to me.
Absolutely.
Either way.
That's right.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was speaking, I think, of children in that case, but you could apply it by extension to all manner of people that are in a situation that's less than your own, that you might be able to help.
Well, actually, that one doesn't come from children.
It doesn't?
No, that I'm trying to remember now what, he says, allow the children to come and things like that about children. But this was, I don't know, maybe it was even in conjunction with the Good Samaritan story. No, it was in conjunction with the man who asked Christ, "Who is my neighbor?" I think. But that was connected to the Good Samaritan too, I think. Anyway, it doesn't matter. The point is clear.
Right.
I'm remembering my trip I took to Humethra in 2003 on a pilgrimage to visit the tomb of Sheikh Shadli. And I read whatever I could find in English either before or after that trip. And they say when he arrived, this village is in the middle of Sahara Desert, but there were wells. There were actually two separate water wells there, and they were able to use those wells to grow things. but the water tasted bad. It was bitter or something. And so when he arrived, he said, "I need water." And they said, "Well, Yashek, it's bitter. We wish we had sweet water, good water, but this is what we have." And he said, "Bring me a cup of water from one of the wells." And they did. And he spat in it. He said, "Now pour the cup back down into the well." And the well water was sweet and tasteful for hundreds of years after that, according to the story I read.
Yeah.
So that's an example. Anyway,
yeah,
example came to mind.
Yeah, there are lots of good stories like that, and whether they actually happen or not is beside the point, in a certain sense, because of the message they give, and we can't verify it ourselves. But
yeah, the time I visited, they were still hauling in water from somewhere else, and that was the practice. They would get trucks would come in for maybe 100 miles or more to bring people water. They had water for agriculture, but it's terrible for drinking.
The water, what is the name of the well that the water is taken from that's at the Kaaba?
Zamzam.
Zamzam, yes.
Right. I have a bottle that has water from there, and it has an inscription in Arabic on it, and I think it says something to the effect that this water has not been known to go bad.
Well, that might be. I have a bottle somewhere too.
Yeah, I've got a bottle.
I also have some holy oil from the Church of the Sepulchre in Jerusalem.
Right.
I need to collect some more holy items, I guess.
Never can get too many relics, right?
Yeah, that's right. But we have these stories, but Aboriginal peoples kind of live them. They don't exist just in the past.
Absolutely. And the whole teaching is that the religious talk their talk and the spiritual walk their talk.
Right.
So it's all about what you do and what your conduct is like.
Right. Right. And when they visit a stone formation that figures in their sacred history, they don't just see a rock.
No, exactly. That's exactly right.
I'm also guessing that Larry said earlier that my story about Humethra was a nice story, whether it was true or not. I suspect the Aboriginals don't ask those kinds of questions. It's just, well, whether it's true or not, The
distinction between the true and the historical is probably not so important.
It's true.
Yes, that reminds me of Black Elk.
Yes.
Who tells the story of the white buffalo calf woman. And after recounting the story, he says, "That's the story. And some say it really happened, and some say it didn't. And me, I don't know that it really happened or not. But you can see that it's true."
Yes, exactly. The story, I had an Irish Catholic priest who was a lovely man. He used to say, the stories are true and some of them happened.
Right.
Oh,
That's good. That's good. Yeah.
That's lovely.
Yeah.
It avoids a subtle kind of idolatry.
Yes, it's true.
Well, I think we're about out of time.
Yeah.
We have
any chance you might join us again, Filipa?
I'd love to join you again. And this is a good time because it's morning in Australia, so I can join you.
Okay.
I'll join you from home.
All right.
Yes. What's the time difference? It's close to 12 hours.
At the moment, it's 9 a.m. in the morning in Sydney, where I live.
Ah, I see.
When do you go back?
In 2.5 weeks.
2.5 weeks.
But one day, Bertha, I'm hoping to come to your house.
Oh, I would love that very much.
I used to live in Indiana a long time ago.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Hi. I mean, what brought you to Indiana?
Oh, sorry.
That seems unimaginable.
It seems unimaginable. It's another very long story, but I went to a Pentecostal church in a cornfield in Indiana for some time where I married and had 2 children.
Oh, my goodness.
Well, you definitely have been in Indiana.
That was the 80s. So I look forward to meeting your skunk.
I would enjoy that very much.
So I was thinking we have two in this group from Indiana. And
True.
there's two of us from the same little city in West Texas, George and myself.
Are you in Texas? I go to Dallas a lot.
I'm in Falls Church right now, but I grew up in Texas and lived there 35 years.
And right now it seems like a foreign land.
Yeah,
Well,
it is a foreign land.
Increasingly. Well, you know, it's always thought of itself as separate. An uncle of mine spent a lot of time in Texas and finally considered himself a Texan.
Yeah.
And my understanding is that they really don't, they see them as separate from the rest of the Union. They see themselves as having an independence from everything, and so they have their own identities.
Yeah, there is something true about that. I noticed when I moved up here at about age 35 to Washington, D.C., and I started going to, there was like a Texas breakfast over in the House office building of Congress, and there was a Texas State Society that had social events 3 or 4 times a year, and the Texans in my agency kind of congregated. And I remember talking to some people from New Jersey, and I said, you know, I get the idea that being from New Jersey is not such a big deal. And they said, yeah, you know, you're from New Jersey, you know, but if you're from Texas, you know, I mean, the first day I worked there, there was a guy from Texas came down to meet me. He said, I heard we have another employee from Texas.
Well, many of the states don't have much of an identity that separates them from their neighbors.
Yeah.
They just have pencil lines on a map.
Yeah.
The Texans are definitely a different breed.
Iowa ends and someplace else begins. But Texas was an actual country of its own before it ever became a state. And I think it's the only state that was like that.
Was it actually its own country, or they just think of themselves that way?
It's the Republic of Texas.
That's true. That's true. Yeah, that's true. But of course, they were part of Mexico before then.
It had a governor. It had all of the different things that, I mean, or actually, I guess they called him a president. I don't know. But at any rate, Sam Houston was the first ruler of Texas.
Oh, yeah.
President, yeah.
And he grew up amongst the Indians in, I think it was Tennessee, or it was one of the eastern states.
Yeah,
and he came to Texas. He was a congressman of the United States Congress, and he resigned his commission when Andrew Jackson driving the Indians out of Tennessee, and he no longer wanted to be a part of that, so he came to Texas. And a lot of the people that came to Texas were of that kind of independent character and did it for reasons that were, you know, more important or had an identity with each other more so than just boundary lines written on a map.
Yeah.
So that's why they have the attitude they have, I think.
Well, then we have the Alamo, of course. So
Yes.
Remember the Alamo.
I remember the Alamo. I went there once.
Sam Houston defeated Santa Anna, and he defeated him and only lost 15 Texans, and Santa Anna had an army of 1,000. And that was at the Battle of San Jacinto, and that was the beginning of Texas right there.
Yeah, but it still would help if the Texans remembered that they really were part of Mexico.
Well, Mexico was part of France, etc. Texas was at one point in time part of France. And if you look at the Indian tribes, there were entirely different groupings of Indians at certain times that were wiped out by other groupings of Indians that came along later, like the Sioux.
Oh yeah, that's true.
Yeah, so
But
and
Mexico hasn't been wiped out.
what belongs to whom it gets kind of murky.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Yes, I know. It's just the whole immigrant thing and the fact that Texas actually used to be Mexico.
anyway, you can with Zoom. You can join us anytime.
I would love to. Now, Larry, is there a any reason? Can we see your face before we go?
Oh, well, I don't know. I don't know. I don't know if I can make that happen or not, actually, because I entered it with the camera turned off.
Well, then all you have to do is click that little icon.
Let me see.
This is called the Great Reveal here.
Great reveal, exactly.
Yeah, I haven't prettied myself up or anything.
We can see you without your lipstick.
I don't know. I don't know if I can survive that.
I haven't shaved in 2 or 3 days.
Here I am.
Oh,
There he is.
Larry, where are you?
How did that happen?
About that.
I have
Thank you for
materialized
being
before your very eyes.
You're perfectly respectable looking. You can show us your face all the time.
Oh. No, it's interesting. When you first showed up, it reminded me of Sidi Ibrahim.
Oh.
Oh, huh.
Of what?
A dear follower of Sheikh Isa, whom we all
It was our
loved
chef.
very much. Sidi
Yes.
Ibrahim, whose other name was
Titus Burkhardt.
Titus Burkhardt.
Titus Burkhardt from
The
Switzerland.
son of a famous sculptor, I believe.
Yeah, it's a well-known family.
And who wrote some beautiful books on history and architecture in the Muslim
Right.
world.
Yes.
So
But,
with that,
but a German. He was definitely German.
Yes.
Or
yes.
Swiss German. I don't know. He was German, wasn't he?
Will we ever get to see the face of the dark god of Eros?
no.
I wouldn't
probably
be
not.
much of a dark god if you could see me.
Well, that's true.
That's true.
The obscurity is part of the identity.
That would ruin the whole thing.